In 1978, Johnny Carson did the one thing a live TV host is never supposed to do. He intentionally sabotaged his own broadcast. While 20 million viewers were distracted by a commercial, a forgotten hot mic captured the king of late night breaking down in a desperate, unscripted attempt to save his best friend's life. This is the tragic, untold story of the night the music finally stopped on The Tonight Show. The year was 1978, and the show was a machine, running on absolute precision, timing, and Johnny's unflappable grace. That night's taping was scheduled to be a breeze, an easy cruise through the monologue, a musical act, and the beloved appearance of Lenny Blake, a comics comic, a titan of the stage who had, in fact, given Johnny some of his first big breaks decades earlier. Their relationship was deeper than showbiz, forged in the trenches of smoky clubs and shared struggles, a bond of profound mutual history and unspoken understanding. But tonight, as Lenny walked out, something was profoundly, irrevocably wrong. The audience, bless their hearts, just saw Lenny's familiar, endearing looseness, the way he leaned a little too heavily on the arm of the sofa, the way his voice had a wet, slow drawl to it. They mistook it for easygoing charm. But Ed McMahon, sitting a mere 10 feet away, heard the subtle slurring, and Doc Severinsen, with his ear for every missed beat, watched Lenny's hands shake as he fumbled for the microphone. Johnny, however, saw the truth clearest of all. Lenny had been battling a long-term dependence on substances, a slow, self-inflicted fading away that Johnny had tried, privately and fiercely, to stop for years. And tonight, the ghost had won, walking right onto Johnny's stage. Lenny wasn't just using, he was broadcasting his pain in 24 frames a second. He kept trailing off, weaving long, confusing stories that were only salvaged by Johnny's legendary rescue skills. Johnny worked harder in those first 10 minutes than he had all week, not performing a comedy routine, but running triage on a sinking ship. He had to be the perfect host, the charming star, while simultaneously being the terrified friend trying to catch a porcelain vase before it shattered. His focus, usually laser sharp, was now divided, his eyes flickering past Lenny's shoulder. He wasn't looking at the camera or the cue cards. He was searching the dark wings of the stage. He was looking for a sign, a signal, a lifeline, a confirmation that the catastrophic scene unfolding was still, somehow, the worst thing that was going to happen that night. This mounting tension, this knowledge shared between Ed and Johnny, created a silent panic that felt like the pressure building beneath the ocean floor. The performance was failing, the friendship was exposed, and the finely tuned Tonight Show clock was counting down to something explosive. The Tonight Show chair wasn't just furniture. It was a throne of responsibility, a pedestal of performance, built on the promise of 90 minutes of impeccable, controlled entertainment. When an emergency happened, the protocols were drilled into the crew like muscle memory. But when the emergency was a beloved friend self-destructing on live national television, there was no script, only the silent, agonizing weight of that famous chair bearing down on Johnny Carson. To understand the agonizing look on Johnny's face, you had to know the history he shared with Lenny Blake. Lenny's belief had been the foundation on which the whole Burbank empire was eventually built. This profound, foundational loyalty kept Johnny from doing the professional thing, cutting Lenny off, sending him to commercials, and never inviting him back. Instead, Johnny tried to steer him gently, tossing him softballs, trying to anchor the comic to reality. "So, Lenny, I hear you were just down in Miami," Johnny asked, his voice smooth but his knuckles white against the desk. "Miami? Yeah, I was there," Lenny mumbled, leaning in too close to the microphone. "Lots of sunshine. But you know what the sun can't shine on, John? The things you try to hide in the dark." The audience tittered, assuming this was some edgy new material. But Johnny felt a chill crawl up his spine. Lenny wasn't talking about comedy. He was using the biggest stage in the world to signal deep personal distress, masking his anguish with a loose, careless demeanor. Ed McMahon, usually roaring with laughter, was now leaning forward, his trademark smile frozen, a look of mounting concern etched into his face. Ed knew Johnny rarely looked away from the interview, but tonight, Johnny's gaze kept drifting past Lenny, past the curtains, settling on the exact spot where the stage floor met the shadows of the offstage world. He feared the real crisis was waiting just beyond the bright light, ready to strike, and his hands gripped the mahogany desk as if holding himself together. Then, just as Lenny began to slur a heartbreaking anecdote about a long-lost family member, Ed saw it too. A shadow moved swiftly in the wings, a figure he immediately recognized as a trusted stage manager, Jimmy. Jimmy made a small, frantic motion, not the normal cue to wrap up, but a strange, urgent gesture that seemed to demand Johnny's immediate, silent attention. Johnny caught the movement, and the fleeting anxiety that had plagued him all night vanished, replaced by stark, undisguised terror. Whatever was happening behind the curtain was far worse than a man with too much to drink making a fool of himself. Jimmy was holding up a small, white piece of paper. He tapped it twice, fiercely, then held his hands in a cross, a universal signal for stop, everything. He pointed to the paper again, then gestured toward a telephone booth, a signal that indicated the message was a wire, a telegram, or an emergency message that had just arrived. The meaning was chillingly clear. The message was vital. It had just arrived, and it was too important to wait for the commercial break. Johnny found a brief gap in Lenny's monologue and, without looking at Ed, smoothly announced a break in the conversation. "We'll be right back with more from the incomparable Lenny Blake after these messages," Johnny said, the classic Carson smile plastered on, yet somehow lifeless. The instant the curtain closed and the stand-by sign flashed, Johnny vaulted out of his chair, a move so quick and uncharacteristic that Ed, who was already rising, stumbled in surprise. Johnny moved straight for the wings, meeting Jimmy halfway. The stage manager didn't speak. He just handed the folded paper over, his hands trembling violently. The note was short, written in a harried scrawl by the NBC switchboard operator. It wasn't a family issue. It was about Lenny. The message relayed a panicked call from a hospital in Chicago, stating that Lenny Blake's only living relative, his young daughter, had been in a terrible accident and was now in grave condition. The note continued with a chilling sentence. Lenny must call urgently before it's too late. He read the 4 lines, and it felt like the entire cavernous studio went silent. His blood pressure spiked so violently he saw spots, and the crisp, composed face of the talk show host completely disintegrated. The problem was no longer controlling a person dealing with a dependency. The problem was that Lenny was about to receive news that would cause great heartbreak. The man who relied on him for rescue was minutes away from having his life irrevocably marred by tragedy. Johnny crushed the paper in his hand, looking back at Lenny, who was blissfully unaware, touching up his makeup. The stakes had just soared from a minor show disaster to a human calamity. The choice was clear. Johnny could continue the show, protecting his ratings, and allow Lenny to receive the news privately later, or he could destroy the perfect flow of the show, risk his career, and stop the broadcast immediately to give his friend a vital few minutes. He had to finish this conversation, extract the necessary information, and orchestrate an exit, all before the studio floor manager signaled the next segment. Lenny Blake, oblivious to the tragic news resting heavily in Johnny's pocket, took a large, shaky sip of water and leaned into the microphone, his eyes unfocused. He wasn't back on the program, he was back on a stage, and he decided to use the opportunity not for a joke, but for a veiled confession that sounded strangely like a plea. "You know, John," Lenny slurred, ignoring Johnny's attempt to transition to a safe topic, "I've been thinking a lot about beginnings and endings. Funny thing, a person spends their whole life running toward the light, right? The spotlight, the applause. But what happens when the light goes out, and you realize you left the only thing that mattered to you back in the dark?" The room went silent. This wasn't the funny, light-hearted Lenny they expected. This was something real, something raw. Johnny, seizing the moment, leaned forward, matching his friend's intensity. "What did you leave behind, Lenny?" he asked, his voice low, intimate, cutting through the vast studio space. Johnny's question was a fishing expedition, a frantic attempt to verify the information in the note without revealing the tragedy. Lenny shrugged, a gesture of profound, aching weariness. "Just a reason, John. A little reason. You know, I've got this little girl. She's in Chicago. She needs me to be better than this." He waved vaguely at his own slouched body. "But I can't even pick up the phone sometimes. She's all I've got left, and if I lose her, well, then I've really got nothing. She's in Chicago. She needs me to be better than this." The hospital note was terrifyingly confirmed. Lenny's daughter was in peril, and the man who should be rushing to her side was trapped on a couch, using his issues as a wall against the world. The show's structure demanded 20 more minutes of small talk, but Johnny knew those 20 minutes could cost Lenny everything. He looked over at Ed McMahon. Ed, silent and alert, met Johnny's gaze, sensing the profound shift in the atmosphere. He saw the genuine private fear behind the famous blue eyes, and in that fraction of a second, understood that the rules of television no longer applied. This was no time for comedy. This was no time for performance. Johnny gripped the edge of his desk, the note crumpling further in his palm. He had to break the machine, violate the sacred contract of live television, and choose the human being over the celebrity. It was the only choice he could live with. Lenny was about to begin another long, rambling story, his voice cracking with self-pity, when Johnny made the sudden, final decision that would shock the control room into silence and leave Ed McMahon utterly stunned. The interview was over, and the show was about to experience a jarring interruption, the reverberations of which would be felt for decades. The television industry is built on time, seconds, minutes, the precise mathematical flow of commercial revenue and content delivery. The control room lights were flashing amber, the 1-minute warning before the next pre-taped segment was due. The producers were mouthing commands from the booth. "Segue, John, segue." They had no idea he was holding a dire notice for his friend's peace of mind. Johnny knew the consequences. Cutting to commercials outside of a scheduled break was unthinkable. It wasn't just poor form. It was a violation of network protocol, costing the sponsors millions and throwing the entire night's scheduling, East Coast to West Coast, into chaotic disarray. It was a career risk, a move no one in his position would ever contemplate. Yet Johnny didn't hesitate, driven by an ethical imperative stronger than any ratings concern. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head toward the producer's booth, signaling, "No, I will not follow the schedule." Then, without a sound, he reached down under his desk. He was reaching for the single, rarely used emergency button that cut the microphone to the audience, but initiated the earliest possible cut to the scheduled commercial break. This button bypassed the show director, bypassing the network feed, acting as a unilateral override. Before the director could scream into his headset, and as Lenny Blake paused for a gasp of breath, Johnny's hand slammed down onto the hidden switch. The sudden, violent disruption was silent to the home audience. They would simply see the standard bumper graphic and hear the familiar jingle for a sponsored product. But on the set, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The huge, brightly lit studio suddenly plunged into an eerie, mechanical half-light. The laughter ended, the band fell silent, and the crew members froze in confusion, their headsets suddenly buzzing with panic. Ed McMahon flinched, jolting upright in his chair, his eyes wide with shock at the blatant, unprecedented breach of protocol. He had seen Johnny handle every disaster imaginable, but he had never, ever seen him destroy the sacred clock. Johnny had purchased a window of silence, a few crucial, off-the-clock minutes, but the cost was incalculable to his professional standing. What the 20 million viewers saw was just a sudden flash of a commercial bumper. But what the 50 stunned people on the studio floor saw was Johnny Carson, the coolest man in America, standing up from his desk and walking around it, deliberately turning his back on the silent cameras. He walked toward his friend Lenny, who was staring blankly at the dark, silent camera lens, completely bewildered. The cut to black had saved the show from being a public tragedy, but it had created a profound and terrifying moment of unscripted vulnerability on the studio floor. A moment that was about to be captured in brutal clarity by an unexpected oversight. The sound of the abrupt, forced cut was the deep, instantaneous silence that followed a sharp impact. A vacuum where 20 million voices had been just a second before. Ed McMahon was the first to move, pulling off his earpiece, but in the chaos, a tiny, crucial error had been made, a lapse that happens once in a career, maybe once in a lifetime. The young technician, Mark, seeing the unscheduled emergency, had scrambled to hit the video off switch, but in his blind panic, he missed the audio mute, creating the most famous, devastating error in network history. The sound waves radiating from the stage, the whispers, the footsteps, the sounds of shock, were still traveling to the television satellites, through the airwaves, and into homes across the country. The iconic studio was now a dark, silent theater for a drama unfolding off-camera, all being secretly piped into the ears of millions. This was the legendary hot mic moment, an accidental broadcast of profound intimacy. Johnny walked slowly toward Lenny Blake, who sat paralyzed on the famous couch. Lenny was staring at the dark camera lens, baffled and defensive. "What was that, John? Did I mess up that bad?" he asked, his voice thick with shame. Johnny ignored the question. He reached out and gently took the glass of water, which was likely not just water, from Lenny's hand, and set it firmly on the table, the small thud echoing loudly in the mic'd space. He then knelt down, placing himself eye level with his friend, an unprecedented gesture of vulnerability for the private, towering star, believing they were absolutely alone, shielded by the commercial break. "Lenny, listen to me," Johnny said, his voice stripped of all its comedic timing and polish. It was just a man, heavy with concern. "That wasn't about the joke or the show. That was about you. And I need you to focus, right now. Forget the show, forget the audience." He pulled the crumpled note from his pocket and slowly, carefully smoothed it out on the pristine carpet. Lenny's gaze followed the motion, confused. "I just got a message, Len. I'm from Chicago. There's been an accident. It's your daughter. You have to call the hospital right now before they can't wait any longer." Johnny's voice trembled slightly on the last few words. Lenny Blake stared at the note, then at Johnny's face, and the alcohol-induced haze that had protected him for hours seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by a devastating clarity. The color drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The sound of Johnny's words, stripped of all performance and amplified by the open microphones, hung in the silent studio air, cutting through the jingle of the commercial being shown on the screen above the band. Ed McMahon, frozen in his chair, heard every syllable. He was no longer Johnny's sidekick. He was an unauthorized, unwilling witness to the deepest expression of friendship he had ever known. Lenny Blake finally found his voice, a strangled, panicked sound. "My daughter, accident." He tried to stand, stumbling slightly. "Johnny, I can't. I can't face this. You don't understand. I haven't spoken to her in 6 months. I haven't been the father I should be. This is my penance." The despair in Lenny's voice was total, broadcast like a radio signal of pure, personal anguish. Johnny quickly helped steady him, gripping Lenny's shoulders, his hands firm and anchoring. "Don't you dare say that, Len. Don't you ever dare talk about penance." The famous Carson cool was gone, replaced by a passionate, almost angry conviction. "Listen to me, Lenny. I've known you since we were kids, broke and sleeping on couches. I've seen you at your worst, and I've seen you at your best. And right now, she doesn't need the successful Lenny Blake, or the funny Lenny Blake, or the ashamed Lenny Blake. She just needs her father." Then, Johnny did something that shocked even the hardened camera operators listening in. He opened a private vault he had kept sealed for a lifetime. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice lower, but the microphone picked up every aching word. "You think you're the only one who messed up, Len? You think you're the only one who wasn't there when it counted? I've made decisions too, friend. I've put this show, this desk, this life, ahead of people I loved dearly. I missed birthdays, I missed hospital visits, I missed moments that I will chase for the rest of my career. And I did it for the silence, for the ease of this chair. You look at me and you see success. I look at myself sometimes and I see an absence, a space where I should have been for people who truly mattered. It was the most vulnerable, unvarnished statement Johnny had ever made about the relentless, often isolating cost of his legendary career. He was offering his own past failures as a shield for his friend, an act of true, selfless connection. The shame is a wall, Len. You use it to keep people out. I know. But you tear that wall down right now. You get on that phone, you tell her you love her, and you walk out of this room knowing you showed up when she needed you most. That's what matters now. The time you missed, you can't fix it. But the next 5 minutes, that's all you have to worry about. He pushed the crumpled note and a personal phone number, scribbled on the back of his own monologue card, into Lenny's hands. I've already had Jimmy clear the back hall. You call the number on this card, tell them it's urgent, and you tell them that I told you to call. Now go. In that moment, the king of late night became something infinitely more profound. A compassionate brother, sacrificing his composure, his image, and his precious show clock to salvage his friend's final chance at dignity and connection. The depth of that sacrifice hung in the air. Ed McMahon, frozen solid in his chair, was mic'd up too, a silent, unintended conduit for the audio feed that was still slipping past the distracted sound engineer. He dared not move, dared not cough, for fear of betraying his position as the ultimate eavesdropper. He heard every syllable. He had always known Johnny was kind, but this act, this absolute sacrifice of the sacred television timetable, this willingness to expose his own weaknesses to save a friend, revealed a depth of humanity that was rarely, if ever, seen in the cutthroat world of Hollywood. Tears, hot and unexpected, began to track silently down Ed's face. Tears of awe for the man he called boss, his finest teacher. Lenny, clutching the note and the phone number, was finally galvanized by Johnny's naked sincerity. The sheer, naked vulnerability of the king of late night seemed to shock the toxins right out of him. He looked at the paper, his hands no longer shaking from dependency, but from terror and urgency. He staggered up from the couch, his feet unsteady, and without a word, he turned and rushed toward the stage entrance, disappearing into the dark corridor toward the nearest private phone. Johnny watched him go, then slowly sank back onto his knees, dropping his head into his hands. The commercial was still running, but the hot mic caught the sound of his ragged, uneven breathing, the sound of a man who had just used every ounce of emotional strength he possessed. The stage crew, finally having fixed the audio feed, cut the sound desk completely, plunging the studio into true, final silence. But the moment was sealed, recorded not on tape, but in the memory of the few who had heard the truth. Ed wiped his eyes quickly, his heart pounding. He knew he had a new, unspoken role, to protect this secret, sacred moment. The return from the final commercial break was perhaps the most jarring moment of the entire night. The cheerful chime of the band felt like a distant, absurd joke, playing against the silent, electric tension that still vibrated through the studio air. Johnny was back at his desk, perfectly groomed, flawlessly composed, but the legendary blue eyes were shadowed, carrying the undeniable burden of a man who had just returned from a war. He finished the show with the practiced ease of a master craftsman, his professionalism ironclad, but there was a quiet, deep focus in his demeanor that was entirely new, a silent commitment to the human equation. The moment the credits rolled and the stage lights began to fade, the performance dropped away entirely. He didn't head straight to the producer's booth to face the inevitable, furious interrogation about the unauthorized cut. Instead, he went straight to the wardrobe department, collected a traveling bag he had already prepared, and quietly instructed the stage manager, Jimmy, to contact him only on his unlisted personal number. He had secured Lenny Blake a quiet, private exit through a back service door, ensuring the press and the paparazzi would never know the true reason the interview had been so chaotic. The cover story, carefully leaked by the network, was that Lenny had suffered an unforeseen medical emergency that forced the quick cut. It was a lie built to protect the show's facade, But Johnny had constructed an even bigger, more compassionate structure behind the scenes, built to protect his friend's life and dignity. Over the next few months, Lenny Blake disappeared from the public eye. What no one knew was that Johnny had personally secured and financed Lenny's immediate placement in a specialized care facility, a place far away from the pressures of show business, focusing entirely on his path to wellness. Johnny didn't just write a check. He arranged the logistics, paid the full costs, and, most importantly, maintained contact. Every week, Johnny would call. Not to talk about the show or comedy or fame, but just to listen. Sometimes the conversation would be brief and difficult. But often, Lenny would report on his gradual improvements, his voice gaining strength and clarity. Johnny always made a point of asking about Lenny's daughter, who, thankfully, made a full recovery from her ordeal. The story was one of silent redemption. Johnny never once mentioned the hospital note, the hot mic conversation, or the personal sacrifices he had made. He simply ensured that the man who had once given him a chance had his own chance at a new beginning. When Lenny was finally well enough to leave the facility, he received a small, anonymous trust fund in his daughter's name, ensuring their security. The only condition attached to the gift was a short legal codicil stating that the identity of the benefactor must remain sealed until 20 years after Johnny's own departure. He simply wanted silence and healing, valuing the privacy of the act above all recognition. For Johnny, the hot mic moment was a turning point. He still sat on the throne, still ruled late-night television, but the performance was different. He saw the audience with a deeper empathy, recognizing that every viewer, every guest, carried their own hidden tragedy. He had stopped performing life and started living it, armed with a powerful, beautiful secret. The greatest applause he ever received was the silent gratitude of a friend whose life he had helped reclaim. Decades later, long after Johnny had hung up his microphone for the final time, and the Burbank studio had gone quiet forever, Ed McMahon was asked in an interview about the most extraordinary moment he ever witnessed on The Tonight Show. Ed didn't talk about acrobats or presidents or musical legends. He paused, his eyes glazing over with a faraway, sentimental look, and he talked about the sound of a silent stage. The greatest thing I ever saw Johnny do, he did off camera, Ed revealed, his voice gravelly with emotion. It wasn't the laughs, it wasn't the ratings. It was the night he decided the most important thing he could possibly do was choose the fragile life of his friend over the indestructible machine of his show. That, Ed explained, was the true meaning of the hot mic moment. It was not a gaffe, it was a sacrifice. The network, of course, launched a full internal inquiry into the unauthorized commercial cut. The director and producers were very displeased, but Johnny, with his quiet, absolute authority, took full responsibility. He simply stated there was an urgent personal crisis requiring immediate attention, and he stood by his decision, knowing his value made him untouchable. The network knew better than to punish the man who brought them 90% of their profit, and the story quietly went away, becoming another piece of forgotten industry lore. But for the few people who heard the hot mic, Ed, Jimmy the stage manager, and a handful of technicians, the event created a profound, silent bond. They understood that night that Johnny Carson's vulnerability was his true superpower. He revealed a secret about the isolation of fame, confessing his own past personal shortcomings to give Lenny Blake the courage to face him. This was the moment Johnny realized that his influence was not just measured by the size of his audience, but by the depth of his compassion for the individual. Lenny Blake, years later, completely well and working quietly as a comedy consultant, never returned to the bright lights of network television. He knew his second chance had come at the expense of a moment of devastating exposure for his friend, and he protected Johnny's secret with his life. He raised his daughter, never touched harmful items again, and often told friends that the man who saved his life wasn't a doctor or a preacher, but the king of late night. Johnny Carson always deflected questions about the personal cost of fame, but people who were close to him knew the hot mic moment changed his perspective. It provided a powerful, secret calibration, a reminder that the fame, the power, and the money meant nothing compared to the quiet dignity of one human being showing up for another when the world was watching, or even when it wasn't. He had cut to commercial early to save Lenny's chance at redemption. In doing so, he redeemed a part of himself, trading the perfect facade of the unflappable star for the raw, aching reality of a true friend. The final, tear-jerking truth of that chaotic night in 1978 is that Lenny Blake came to The Tonight Show seeking fame and applause, but he walked away with a life. Johnny Carson came to work expecting an easy taping, but he walked away with something infinitely more valuable than ratings, a profound, beautiful reminder that every single life, no matter how troubled, matters more than all the gold of Hollywood. He proved that sometimes the bravest thing a legend can do is stop the show. If you found this look into the hidden heart of late-night history moving, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel.